Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. Hey, it's been a few weeks since I've recorded here. I had a surgery recently on my bicep, tore my bicep. For those who don't know, that happens. For me, it happened while I was baptizing someone. So all my Presbyterian brothers have had a great chuckle out of this in my Baptist ways, but I did have surgery. I'm recovering still. Got a nice arm brace on for the next few weeks. But I've been taking a product I want to let you know about in my recovery called Ion Layer, and it's been really useful for me in my recovery. Actually, you've probably heard it if you've listened to the podcast before. I use these patches pretty regularly for recovery after a workout, mental acuity, all that kind of stuff. And so head over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. These are kind of IV type drips that you don't have to get an IV for. Those are typically thousands of dollars. Instead, you can get things like an N80 plus infusion through a medical grade patch directly in your skin, and it really helps you recover after workout or even after a surgery. So head over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. They're super affordable, and I think you should use them because I do. I think they're great. Today on the show, we're going to talk about retrieval. Now, I'm going to warn you, listener, before we get into the conversation with Jonathan here today. This is a fairly niche topic. I'm admitting that up front. I don't imagine this podcast will be the most downloaded ever. I think it's an important one, though. How we do history, how we think about history is very relevant to our times, because especially in the last decade, we've seen the kind of the Cultural Revolution tear down statues, deface monuments, really want to rewrite history, most famously with the 1619 Project. This is a topic of interest to me because part of my research is history, doing history well, looking back at our forefathers, trying to understand them. And so this has been a theme I've brought up on the podcast before. But in this episode, we're going to talk about retrieval and how to do it well with Jonathan Tomes. There's a symposium going on over at American Reformer with several authors contributing. Jonathan's article over there, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, we'll discuss it on air, is going to be on retrieval from the margins. It's a response to John Ehret and how we do history well. And so I really hope this conversation with Jonathan helps you think about how you do history, but it also is interesting for me on a more personal level, and how we think about friendship and networks, relationships, and that kind of thing, and how people will distance themselves or grow close to other people over time. And so I try to broaden the conversation that way. So Jonathan was a great guest today, and I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Jonathan, you wrote an article for American Reformer called Retrieval from the Margins. It sparked my interest. I thought it was a wonderful article. It's part of a symposium over there at American Reformer. And so I reached out to you to get you on the show because I wanted to talk about it. It's an area of interest for me. And if it's an area of interest for me, it's going to be an area of interest for my listeners. Before we get into the article itself, I wanted our listeners to hear a little bit about you, your background, maybe some of your schooling, that kind of thing.
Okay, great. So I do have a Master of Divinity from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Ever since then, I have been largely Anglican. My family and I, we now live in San Antonio, and it looks like we might be visiting Orthodox Presbyterians in the area.
That's great. And then what's like an area of interest for you?
So interest-wise, I am a research librarian for more than last 10 years. It's been more than that since then. I have been in library science in the library field. And then, so my interest in retrieval comes from friendships I've accumulated over the years, interest in what other people are studying, researching, learning, and this has brought me into contact with primary sources and with whole new areas of learning and different traditions. So my interests are broad. My interests are necessarily broad because of my own professional background, but also because of what I see the purpose of study for in my own life, which is to not just to enrich the life of my mind, or to think through practices in my own life. All that's great, all that's valid, but also to enrich the bonds of friendship.
That's great. This is actually a very interesting topic to me, friendship. If we could deviate a little bit about that. Many people in our day are confused about how to have friends, how to make friends, what is the nature of friendship. Could you talk about why that's so meaningful to you, why you're interested in that? Kind of how would you help Like if your area of interest and the way you've made friends is through kind of researching these things and meeting other people in that way, what is the significance of friendship? I think a lot of people kind of have a category mistake when it comes to
Hmm.
how they relate to people and how they interact and how they make friends and that kind of thing. And our world is desperately lonely. I mean, there's a lot of lonely people out there who are very isolated, atomistic. And so, how would you describe good friendship to the listener?
For me, these friendships were born out of so Facebook groups, social media, eventually Twitter. They were always polemical, always as we face up to modern challenges, modern ills, controversies, theological, ecclesial, personal. We're talking about these issues as we are also engaging with the tradition, as we are so revisiting Calvin. And at the time, it was Calvin versus the Calvinists. You rarely hear that anymore because we won, right? And then friend, these conversations are happening, and your meetings, you have these opportunities to meet so many intelligent, winsome people, and some of whom were in PhD programs, some of whom were pastors, but many of whom also were just librarian. So that that's me, or in other fields, so layman. It wasn't a purely intellectual, or I should say purely professional academic conversation or circle, right? So we're engaging with one another. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cool, and the conversation is just never ending, and it's running. Not militaristic, not an army actually, but challenging. We're revisiting Calvin, not just the institutes, but sermons, letters, history, friendships, circles, and all that, of course, is very academic, but it's also confronting individuals, confronting the church with a tradition, with a history, with that has gone wrong, that has obviously gone wrong. So that's the environment in which these friendships developed, grew, and then and that was an enriching environment for as long as it could last.
So with polemical and all this kind of stuff, that's what I sensed when I kind of like found my way into a lot of the conversations on this. A lot of brilliant people who have done deep research and are well read, well studied, and can articulate their viewpoint or understanding of a text or position very, very well, and also distinguish between things. I found that very refreshing. A lot of the world that pastors live in, unfortunately, doesn't have that. It's a lot of like kind of fake leadership
Mm,
stuff, and instead, it
sure.
was more like, hey, there's people actually asking questions. One of the books that brought me into kind of an interest in retrieval was Calvin's Company of Pastors. um, I found that really helpful. It was recommended to me by another pastor. And I particularly was reading it because I actually started reading it before COVID, but during COVID, I was reading it and just looking at how they kind of handled disease in Geneva. And I was like, wow, there's actually different ways that people approach these matters. That's really helpful, and like we can look back to history. I'm wondering for you, Jonathan, was there any kind of thing? I mean, you went to Southern post Southern or either at Southern, was there something in your mind that sparked your interest in retrieval?
I think many are going to share this sentiment, but my interest in retrieval was sparked by Dr. Michael Haken. I think many people have said this. So that was my first interaction with history, tradition, texts in a way that did have great theological, personal value, that was deeply devotional and eminently practical.
Yeah, Michael Haken was my first PhD
Hmm.
supervisor, so he was very helpful for
Hmm.
me getting started in retrieval. So I think it would be helpful at this point, though. We kind of danced around it, but for the listener who's unfamiliar with this concept of retrieval, even pastors who may have gone to seminary, this is not. I mean, maybe Haken brings it up in his classes at Southern. I have no idea, but this concept of retrieval, it's not novel, but to many people it will feel novel as a field of study because most people are studying preaching or hermeneutics or church history or that kind of thing. So help me understand when we're talking about retrieval, what is it we're talking about?
Okay, I'm treating it more like an activity. So it's a return to, as I've said, sources, to the fountain for engagement in the present, for challenge in the present. So as we go back to Calvin, Luther, Richard Hooker, and many, many others, we labor to understand the text, understand the main context. All that is fair, all that's valid and important. We're not making a cheap use of sources to win an argument in the present. And yet the goal still is for some impact today, right? Not just, as I said in the essay, to hang it up on the wall in a museum. We're not curators, we're not archivists. And actually, in this activity, we're not librarians arranging and cataloging. We want to be challenged. We want to see through their eyes, but also so that we can see with our own fresh eyes in the present. So, what we face, but also what's possible in the future, to be open to receive that.
And how might, just because I'm a more of a historian as I have to be, I've never been a historian, but that's kind of the nature of my research is it's a bit of retrieval, studying the theological anthropology, which is a modern kind of conception of a category on Thomas Hooker, the New England Puritan. How is pure history maybe different from retrieval?
There are many different historical methodologies and different ways to treat the historical discipline. So depending on your preferred version, what I'm describing might sound just like what you're already doing in history, right?
Right.
So many studying history today already have more constructive methodologies that they're employing, right? But what I am specifically pushing back against is history as merely noting developments, merely arranging ideas in a specific order. And not just noting, but also limiting. So narrowing your vision so that you're only seeing like, oh, this part of liberalism or that part of liberalism, and everything is going towards today, to this moment. And I think uh, everyone will want to reject that, and yet that's what I think I hear as I read John's essay.
Okay, great.
Right? They think that's what I hear.
Yeah, that's what I see a lot of that as well. I mean,
Hmm.
because I think it's any good historian who kind of puts his ideas out there and tries to do history well wants it to be enjoyable for people. Some of the worst histories are just kind of like you said. Most children are bored with history in school because it feels like rote memorization and just kind of
That's right.
archival fact finding and that kind of thing. Um, and yet, what I discovered as I started asking questions in these spaces and asking questions, even in my pastoral meetings with people and how we think about being a pastor in a church and Christians in the modern world, um, it's fairly irrelevant and unhelpful to just be an archivist and just to be like, well, Calvin said this once. It's like, yeah, but why does it matter for me in my life? Like, and I think there's a fear that we would just kind of dumb down whether we call it retrieval or history or both, to be just practical. It's only useful insofar as it's practical, and of course, I don't believe that. At the same time, I think that as we do this kind of thinking, as we go back and look at primary sources and kind of unearth Calvin's sermons that people haven't read or anything like that, I think it's important to show why it's practical because there's real answers that we can get from the past. Because I don't think these modern kind of ideologies and the ills of liberalism can be solved by under a liberal framework. I think there needs to be kind of a retrieval going on to broaden people's
Hmm.
horizon into what's possible. In your essay,
That's
you
right.
talk about the difference between thick and thin retrieval. Can you tell the listener more about that if they haven't read the essay yet? I'll put a link in the show notes. But what is the difference between thick and thin retrieval?
Thick retrieval is what we've been doing up to this point.
Okay.
I've also referred to it as expansive. You could call it total history. We are interested in not just Calvin, not just Luther, and returning over and over and over and again to the same topics, the same sources, but also discovering new voices within the Reformed tradition, Protestant tradition, the Catholic tradition, to understand the movement, to understand the whole, to have a better sense of the parts, its diversity. That was a phrase you saw more often in titles, right? I had the fortune to help edit a book by that name, Beyond Calvin. That was with Brad Littlejohn several years back with the Davenant Institute. So to observe, and that is an example of expansive retrieval, of thick retrieval, because there are essays in poetry, there's essays in the social order, the political order. It was one of Stephen Wolf's last essays, I believe, with the Davenant Institute published. So that would be an example of thick. So we're talking about everything, right? Not believing, affirming, confirming, receiving, but it's a total engagement, right? Thin retrieval is limited, right? So it's limited. Certain authors, certain topics, certain parts, right? Things that are safe, that have been sort of cleansed by sort of a magisterial hand and sanctified to be received by a modern audience, with the goal, and this is stated, right, with the stated goal of maturity under modernity. And I don't think that should be the goal at all in retrieval, that kind of maturity under modernity. I mean, maturity is fine as such, right? Virtue, that's good. But why would modernity be the goal of retrieval? Right? Why would that be the goal?
Right.
And I think, and that's why I've referred to it also as retrieval after the end of history. Retrieval, Protestant retrieval as end of history liberalism, right? So the ideologies are dead. Liberalism won, right? So now that's the atmosphere. Liberalism just is the atmosphere globally in which we all engage. So I reject that as the framing for retrieval. So I also refer to modern ideological embarrassments. In that sense, I think retrieval should be full-throated. It doesn't mean you're going to like everything you see, but you need to go see it, right? You need to see it at the ground level. And then my hope is a new beginning. My hope is what it always has been, I believe, for Protestant retrieval, which is a new beginning for magisterial Protestantism. In his essay, he says, there's a logic to this move. Framing the question in this way implies that somewhere in the course of recent time, an authentic Protestant tradition was abandoned in favor of a limp modern substitute. Of course it was. And I say that. I say obviously that that's a common point. That's a point shared in common with everyone practicing the expansive retrieval from the beginning. You see it in the Calvinist International, and you see it in the Davenant Institute, and you see it at American Reformer. That's something up until now held in common.
So you just mentioned the Calvinist International, which actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask, because when I started getting into the kind of this topic, as I mentioned, a lot of it, and I sent out a tweet about this, a lot of it was because it got so-called radicalized by kind of the situation on the ground as a pastor, in my family and BLM and COVID and all this kind of stuff. And so, I found myself all of a sudden following people, interacting with people who already knew each other. There was a conversation going on, and they would use words that I was not familiar with, like irenicism, convivium, all this kind of stuff. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. There's like a whole conversation going on. So what is the Calvinist International? Kind of like, what is if we're going to do some really brief retrieval on the retrievalists? What is the movement?
Find some terms.
Yeah. What is that movement like?
All right, so the Calvinist International was it's a now defunct website. You can still find it on the Wayback Machine, which is difficult for me to use. Some are better at this. I attempted to find some examples to showcase what it is exactly I'm getting at, but that is what I mean by expansive retrieval. So in John's essay, he talks about he makes it seem as if we proceed from a more pure conversation surrounded by in theology, centered in theology proper, to a conversation, to a retrieval that's more consumed with the social political order. But when you go back and you look at the Calvinist International, you see essays in natural law, thick complementarianism, uh, classical two kingdoms, quite a bit of conversation about classical two kingdoms, which is inherently about the ecclesial and political order. And then issues of application in social order, right? So that was always happening. So yeah, websites, different authors. So Stephen Wedgeworth was the owner of the website. You'd see Brad Littlejohn on it occasionally. Peter Escalante was a big contributor. Eric Hutchison, many others. Many of these same people you now see writing solely for or mostly for Davenant and Ad Fontes, but also sometimes for American Reformer. So much of the same kind of work, and not that different from what you now see in the American Reformer. The
Okay.
reflex to cover just a whole host of topics and issues, and not get bogged down in uh, so say a minutia of a pure history, but sometimes you talk about Trump,
Right. Oh no.
right? Right?
Yeah, I mean, when it's amazing because when I started getting into the stuff, it was like I quickly discovered myself stepping on rakes, and I didn't even mean to, because I was like,
Hmm.
wait, I thought you guys were like polemical and could talk about all sorts of stuff, and now all of a sudden I'm like I'm violating some norms. So you mentioned earlier, and I want to ask about this. Help me better understand what are the norms that are being presented either in John's essay, or what are you seeing out there? Like, what are, I guess the most succinct way to put it is, what are not safe topics? What are topics that are being avoided right now?
Okay, so previously, all topics were safe, even though they were always dangerous, right? But they were there was freedom in discourse. You might get smacked down. You might get scolded, right? You might cross some line, right? But the conversations were happening, and incredibly broad. So you see a narrowing of allowed discourse after 2016, right? So after 2016, you start to see that narrow down, and then into 2019, I think it's severely limited by then, and then shortly thereafter, the Calvinist International website goes down. As you know, it's no longer up, and some insiders are now outsiders. Many listeners may already know some of that history, but I'm not sure how well these things actually are known. There was always within Protestant retrievals some who were more comfortable in the liberal tradition, right? And then some who were more obviously out of it or on the fringes of it. And then so these scholars, right, these friends, they could all exist. They could all be in the same conversation, and then there comes a point in which that's no longer possible, right? So you see this is narrowing effect, and I think so. That phenomenon sets us up for this essay, the end of Protestant retrieval, because this I think is the fulfillment of that trend you see, which amazingly involves a rewriting of retrieval history. So as I'm sitting down reading it, I'm just feeling like this disassociative kind of experience. Like, wait, I was there. right?
Right.
And many were there. It wasn't that long ago, right? So just to see that published without any remarks, right, was unsettling,
Yeah.
right? So you can feel a little gaslit in the process.
Yeah, I remember the same
Right.
feeling. We talk about it when our church was in Acts 29. It was that kind of feeling of like, wait a second, like this whole like thing was like Driscoll, and love him or hate him. I mean, he's out there doing his thing now, but
Mm-hmm.
to tell us like, no, we can't act that way or behave that way, and our network has never been about this. I'm kind of like, that's lying.
Yeah.
Like you're
Yeah.
you're making things up, and that really gets certain, I guess me, maybe you, that gets certain guys pretty fired up to be like, you can't do that. Like that's not honest, or whatever you want to call it. It seems really disingenuous to try to make it
Mhm.
that way. Um, but yeah, I think you're right. Like there seemed to be, like, I came right at the tail end of what you described the timeline as. And as I'm getting into it, I'm like, wow, you guys have written a lot on like men and women and state
Mhm.
and church, and there's robust discussions, and that's really fun. And then all of a sudden there was like, oh
Mhm.
wait, some of these guys seem to hate each other. I'm sure they don't truly hate each other, but there seems to be some beef, and
Mhm.
that was pretty weird to me. I'm pretty uninterested in it. I'm probably not as smart as a lot of guys, anyways. But it was just an odd sociological and kind of pastoral as well. Like I was like, oh, that's sad. I don't want to see that.
Yeah, it is. It is sad. It is sad because it's the rupture of something that was great, right? And that's what I see. I see I see fault lines. What I've detected in the end of Protestant Retrieval essay. So these aren't issues in which you can have an ironic conversation around, right? A peaceful conversation. That this isn't a point for like unity within diversity within unity, overarching unity. These are seismic fault lines. This is absolutely injurious to any kind of coalition, right? You have cut out in these statements, I don't know, half. I really couldn't say at this point. These things are becoming further removed from me, but you're excluding a considerable contingent of your participants,
Right.
right?
It's wild. It's wild.
In a not nice way,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
And not honest.
not.
It's like, not the whole polemical thing was like actually admirable. It was seen as
Yeah.
manly, courageous. And now it's like, we're not even going to be polemical. It seems like there's a lot of, and for the listener, I hope this isn't too vague. Like I think what interests me, Jonathan, about this particular topic and the broader topic is what we talked about at the beginning: friendship, how friendships kind of end, begin, that kind of thing, and how people relate to one another. And what I've seen is kind of a kind of desire to curry favor. Um, and this is common to people. This isn't uncommon. It's not as if it's one person doing this. We all have a tendency to do this. I've even sensed that, just to be transparent on my podcast, I've sensed that as a temptation in the kind of the podcast space market is, it's like you could play a game. There's a game to be played. You get one guest, and then you can kind of do this game where it's like, oh, who's the next biggest guest I can get? And you could play that game. And that's not illegitimate. But when we do that and then also try to dump our friends because they don't let me play the game and succeed, I view that as kind of gross. Like that doesn't seem to be the way that Christians should treat one another. At the same time, I understand it. It's not crazy to me.
Right. Right. So I did include that. I did include that in my response. I see. I see that phenomena as an attempt to like sort of control and direct the outcomes of retrieval. Right. So the narrowing of the agenda is to arrive at certain conclusions because, and I've said that that's sourced in sort of 20th century modern, right, political ideological embarrassments, because of one's response to that, um, you see a previous openness towards discourse narrow, increasingly narrow. So post-liberalism, right? So I don't want to injure some friends in their post-liberal ecclesiocentric projects. I'm not talking about them or that, but my target just is that sort of the end of history liberalism, right? Because we want to have a new beginning for Protestant magisterialism. We don't want to just have it subsumed in this whole monstrous modern mess, right? So it's just one more discordant piece,
Yeah,
right?
there's a desire almost to be respectable, and I think all men naturally desire to be someone who's respected. That's not wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but when that becomes the
Right,
kind of predominant thing that you're aiming
right,
for, it really gets sideways in my mind.
right. So it's a desire for legitimation, right? If you need your movement to be accepted in the academy, right, in academia, um, then you have to cancel, right? You have to react a certain way. You have to denounce on command. You have to, and this violates fundamentally how I've looked at retrieval, which is, and I really do love that last quote, which I've taken from lectures from Michael Millerman. So I've called retrieval a philosophy of debris, a common impulse toward everything that was discarded, toppled, and humiliated during the construction of a postmodern society. Everything that was rejected, that was marginalized, that was kicked out of the center, that was canceled, erased, all of that suddenly becomes fair game and a matter of interest. So retrieval that is thin, that is concerned with legitimacy, isn't going to do that. It can't do that, right? Because those things are inherently dangerous, right? But we don't. When we do retrieval activity, we have, as the political philosopher Alexander Dugin um, advises, we've broken the hermeneutical circle, right? We're not taking these things as a whole. We're going into them. We're looking at their hearts. We're looking through their eyes. We're seeing what's missed, what could have been, for our own social political imagination, right?
Yeah,
And it's that breaking of the whole that's sort of foundational, that overcomes the fear, right? The fear in the legitimacy seeking, right? They think what we're actually doing, which isn't what we were ever doing before, is going to old texts, you know, reading them partially, right? Maybe quote mining, or reading them badly, or reading them fully but believing everything we read, right? And then immediately applying it sort of as a one-to-one ratio. I always wonder, as I see those concerns expressed, who's doing that? Whoever does that, but don't do that,
yeah, I think that would be
right?
helpful. Yeah, because when I don't have the time to do a lot of the work that you do, for example. It's not my church isn't employing me to go read um, long lost facsimils from the Puritans. At the same time, they endorse my research, but um, there is kind of this temptation to own one another by finding a banger quote to kind of like you know win an argument. And I don't even think that impulse is necessarily wrong, but I do think we want to encourage people to be more well read and understand the quote or the person, whether it's an ox or anybody, in context, to be able to articulate it in a better way. Again, not saying that you can't go, find some quotes and that kind of thing. I'm researching right now on a project, and I haven't read everything by Calvin. That doesn't make me illegitimate, and it doesn't mean that because I've
No.
read some of Calvin, I can't offer what my understanding of Calvin is, and I can't receive criticism on my perspective. So there should be kind of a robust, like you talked about early on, way to engage in these things. So with all this said, what is kind of the way forward? I mean, is this project dead? How do we kind of navigate a way forward here?
I think the way forward for Protestant Retrieval is to sustain continuity with where we've come from, right? So expansive, ironic, um, ready to listen to others, to texts, to traditions, to what I've called the marginalia of history, right? A readiness to be challenged in our assumptions about what we think ought to have been said. I think we need to wrestle with new technological methodologies, right? So AI translation, prompt engineering, collaborative work between that and human translators and teams, and that the way what comes next will be faster, more thorough, yet reliable, right? This will enable us to go to reach into parts of the tradition that we could have taken 50, 100 longer. Translation work is slow, right? Incredibly slow. But these new opportunities accelerate retrieval. So I've referred to this next iteration as accelerated retrieval, which is dangerous, right? Which does so that presents far more material than we've ever had access to before, right? So I want the fountains of Protestant retrieval to be open, and then wherever I said wherever there's a nourishing deposit to dig roots there, and to be challenged, to learn, to see, and then to return again to the modern questions, modern challenges, the future, what comes next, and what we build.
Yeah, that's great.
Not
It's
not not to yeah, not to build as I said as they built or what they built, right? But to discover what it is that needs to happen now.
Yeah. And I think that's a great topic because as someone who's not, I mean, I took Greek and Hebrew and studied Latin in middle school, but I've forgotten all my Latin. I mean, I can recognize it and probably do something with it. But guys like you are incredibly helpful in this because like this is your area of expertise. And I'm really excited
Mm-hmm.
about all the kind of like tech where all of a sudden you can kind of mine the sources and translate things quickly. But you're indispensable. People like yourself aren't going to be indispensable for this to keep it on the rails, so to speak. I don't mean on the rails to be safe. I mean on the rails to make sure those translations are accurate and
Right.
that the work being done is quality. But it makes my life a lot easier as someone who's not, I don't know German, I don't know French, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a really exciting time. I think where I'd like to close, if the listeners made it thus far, if somebody's hearing this and going, you know what, that may be something I'm curious to know more about. Maybe they're like me
Mm-hmm.
and they don't know the languages and that kind of thing, but they would like to read some of these sources and they would like to dip their toe in the water of retrieval. Where would you recommend someone start, or where could someone go to become familiar? Maybe not get in the space like that's going to be their job or vocation, and they're not going to go to
Mm-hmm.
symposiums or that kind of thing, but
Right.
how would somebody get interested if somebody's interested in retrieval? How could they get started?
Partial to the way I started. Start with primary sources. Start with texts. Start with talking with others, with friends about those texts. Right? Don't start with books about books, but try to return to the actual fountain of the Reformed tradition, of the Protestant and Western traditions. Right. So yeah, start there. I have my own projects. I hope that you will be interested in them, that you will be edified. That this work that I'm doing, that we're doing, will have a good effect, right? But that's where I would start, right? So primary sources and friendship.
And then where specifically, if somebody's like, I want to find primary sources, are there
Mm-hmm.
websites or where can people go to find those?
You can go to PRDL, the Post Reformation Digital Library. You can find many sources in English, right? English PDFs. You will see Latin, you will see other language sources, but there is an incredible wealth of English language sources just available for you right now on PRDL. I'll be announcing in the next week or so my own press that's attempting to implement the methodology I lay out in my response to John Ehret in that essay. We'll be publishing works in early modern political theory, gender, friendship specifically. Will be all across the map. So pay attention.
That's great. Well, that's a great way to wrap up. If people want to keep up with either that or other work you do, what's the best place to follow you and make sure they're staying current with what you're working on?
All right. So the best source is Twitter, X. You can find me on X at Post Nuance. X is the best source of news. So you can find news about what I'm doing there.
Great. All right. I'll put a link in the show notes for the listener. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Of course. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Jonathan Tomes talking about retrieval. I know I did. Hey, if you enjoyed it, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, give it a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you are. Share it with a friend who you may also be reading books from old dead guys regularly with, maybe guys in your church or any other guys. Share this with them, and that's a great way to get the podcast out there to more people. You can also sign up on the Patreon. Link is in the show notes for that. $5 a month or $15 a month to get early access to every episode, get some swag sent to you that way, and it's a great way to keep me motivated, keep me hungry, coming back, delivering good interviews and good content to you. So subscribe, sign up on the Patreon, and we'll see you next time.